Kelly and Conway thought she could twist reality, but what happened next silenced her in seconds. It began with a smirk. Conway leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with the kind of confidence only someone who's been rewarded for distortion could carry. She finished her line with a smug laugh, tossing her words into the room like a grenade. For a split second, she believed she had landed the final blow. Her supporters nodded. Some even chuckled, as if the debate was already hers. The room went quiet, but not with agreement. Quiet with tension. You could almost hear hearts pounding in the audience, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Would Jasmine Crockett take the bait? Would she let the insult stand? Then came the spark. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't stammer or fumble for notes. She raised her eyes, calm but piercing, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her reply cut through the silence like a blade. No theatrics, no wasted words. Just a truth so sharp it sliced Conway's argument to ribbons in seconds. The audience gasped. Some even leaned forward in their seats, jaws dropping at the speed and precision of the takedown. Then, as the weight of Crockett's words sank in, the gasps transformed into cheers. Applause thundered through the hall, rolling like a wave from the back rows to the front. Conway's smirk faltered. For once, the seasoned spin master had no ready line, no clever deflection. She blinked, searching for footing, but the moment had already slipped away. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. They were with Crockett, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And Crockett? She didn't bask in it. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned back, her expression steady, as if to say, "This is what happens when arrogance meets truth." That was the moment, those electrifying seconds, that turned a debate into a spectacle, a clapback into a cultural reset. Conway had tried to command the stage with bravado. Crockett owned it with clarity.
But to understand why this comeback hit so hard, you need to know the storm that led up to this moment. Hashtag, the debate stage wasn't just a room with microphones and bright lights. It was a stage set for America itself. Cameras panned across a packed audience, every seat filled, every eye locked in anticipation. This wasn't some small-town political squabble. It was a forum broadcast nationwide, streamed live, and dissected in real time across countless screens. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't about points on a scoreboard. It was about who got to define the truth in a time when lies spread faster than facts. It was about whether arrogance would once again bully its way into dominance, or whether a new kind of leadership, rooted in dignity, would finally seize the moment. Inside the hall, you could feel the weight of history pressing down. Every cheer, every groan, every murmur was part of something larger. This wasn't just Crockett versus Conway. This was the fight over America's voice, America's conscience. And the crowd knew it. When Conway leaned forward with her smug grin, thinking she'd cornered Crockett, the room tensed as if a storm cloud had passed overhead. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. On social media, the comments flew. Here it comes. She better respond. This is the moment. And in that moment, you could sense it. This clash wasn't going to stay confined to that stage. By morning, clips of what was about to unfold would dominate timelines. Memes would explode across platforms, and commentators would scramble to define what it all meant. But the deeper you look at Kelly and Conway's playbook, the more shocking the setup becomes. Hashtag, to understand why the crowd's reaction carried such force, you have to understand the figure Jasmine Crockett was up against. Kellyanne Conway wasn't just another debater tossing out rehearsed lines. She was a brand, a symbol, the embodiment of political spin in its most polished, unapologetic. Spin in its most polished, unapologetic form. Her rise to notoriety didn't come from mastery of policy or a legacy of service. It came from her mastery of distortion. When most politicians stumbled under the weight of their own contradictions, Conway seemed to thrive in them. She didn't run from lies, she rebranded them. Who could forget the moment she coined the phrase, alternative facts? In just 2 words, she managed to take a blatant falsehood and frame it as a legitimate perspective. It was Orwellian theater performed on live television, and she carried it with a straight face. Over the years, Conway perfected the art of deflection. Ask her a direct question, and you'd receive a 5-minute answer that twisted so many corners it left audiences dizzy. She would smile, tilt her head, and speak with the kind of confidence that made even her most outlandish claims sound, at least momentarily, plausible. To her supporters, this was cunning. To her critics, it was shamelessness polished into a career. Her contradictions were impossible to miss. One day, she denounced hypocrisy. The next, she embodied it. She railed against corruption, then defended it when it suited her allies. She talked about morality, then excused behavior that violated every moral she had ever preached. Time and again, she proved that her loyalty wasn't to truth, justice, or even consistent values. It was to the performance of power. But arrogance has a way of showing itself in the smallest gestures. Conway's smirk became her signature. It wasn't the smile of warmth. It was the smirk of someone convinced she could outwit anyone in the room. The eye roll, the shrug, the carefully timed laugh. It was all theater, designed to belittle her opponents and signal to her followers that she was untouchable. And yet, beneath the veneer of confidence, there were cracks. Journalists pressed her on inconsistencies, and rather than answer, she danced around them. When cornered, she leaned on sarcasm, shifting blame, or simply talking over her critics until the conversation collapsed. Her evasions weren't clever, they were exhausting. Audiences who once chuckled at her cleverness eventually grew weary of the circus. By the time she sat across from Jasmine Crockett, Conway wasn't just a political operative. She was a caricature of manipulation itself. To many, she represented everything wrong with modern politics. The triumph of spin over substance, the elevation of arrogance over accountability. She wasn't simply arguing her case. She was wielding the same bag of tricks she'd used for years, assuming that once again, charm and distortion would drown out truth. The audience, however, had changed. America had changed. People were tired of the games. They had lived through years of being told what they saw with their own eyes wasn't real, of watching leaders bend reality until it nearly snapped. Conway's smirk didn't charm them anymore. It grated on them. Every deflection, every half-truth, every smug dismissal was like salt on a wound that had been festering for far too long. That's why, when she leaned into her microphone during that debate, the room didn't erupt with admiration. Instead, you could see heads shaking, lips pursing, eyes narrowing. Viewers at home didn't tweet admiration. They tweeted memes mocking the predictability of her act. She wasn't commanding respect. She was inviting ridicule. Kellyanne Conway had built her career on dodging accountability, on twisting words until they lost their meaning. But this time, she was facing someone who refused to play by those rules. Across from her was a figure not defined by distortion, but by clarity. Not by arrogance, but by grit. Not by performance, but by service. And yet, across from her stood someone with a very different story. One forged in grit, service, and an unshakable voice. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive on that debate stage by accident. Her presence wasn't the result of inherited power or backroom deals. It was earned, step by step, battle by battle, sacrifice by sacrifice. To understand the force of her comeback against Kellyanne Conway, you have to trace the journey of a woman who never waited for permission to speak truth, who carved her own path through the kind of resistance that would have broken others. Born and raised with the grit of working-class America in her veins, Crockett's life was far removed from the polished smugness of the political elite. Her story wasn't about gilded privilege. It was about resilience. She grew up witnessing the struggles of families who worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. She saw the cracks in the system not as abstractions in policy reports, but as lived realities. The mother denied fair wages, the neighbor evicted without due process, the young man locked up for a mistake that wealthier counterparts could pay their way out of. Instead of turning away, Crockett leaned into the fight. She pursued law not as a career path to wealth, but as a weapon for justice. In courtrooms across Texas, She became known not as someone who played nice with power, but as someone who confronted it head-on. She defended those who couldn't afford top-dollar attorneys, the people the system too often ground down and forgot. Each case was more than a paycheck. It was a statement. Your dignity matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. Her reputation grew, not because she played politics, but because she refused to bow. Judges noticed her persistence, opponents recognized her sharpness, and clients trusted her with their stories. She carried that reputation into the political arena, not by seeking the limelight, but by answering calls from her community. When people needed someone who wouldn't back down from arrogance, they turned to her. Her rise to Congress was anything but smooth. The road was littered with doubters, critics, and opponents who dismissed her as too direct, too passionate, or too disruptive. But for every insult, Crockett found fuel. She didn't dilute her voice to fit into political molds. She sharpened it. She ran on a platform that didn't flatter the powerful, but instead elevated the unheard. And the voters responded, not with apathy, but with conviction. They sent her to Washington as their champion, their defender, their proof that dignity could still win elections. Even in Congress, she never shed the qualities that defined her as a lawyer: precision, fearlessness, and the refusal to be intimidated. Colleagues quickly learned that Crockett didn't play games. She listened carefully, spoke deliberately, and struck with clarity when the moment demanded. She wasn't interested in showmanship for its own sake. Every word she spoke carried the weight of her community. Every argument the echoes of countless lives silenced by the machinery of indifference. And arrogance? She had faced it all before. Judges who thought they could dismiss her. Opposing lawyers who underestimated her. Commentators who sneered at her background. She stood through it all, not with bitterness, but with unshakable composure. Her calm was her armor, her clarity the weapon. Time and again, she transformed dismissal into respect, mockery into silence, underestimation into awe. That's what made her presence on the stage with Kellyanne and Conway so powerful. She wasn't just a politician in a debate. She was a woman forged in the fire of real battles, carrying the scars and the triumphs of someone who had never been handed anything. To watch her sit across from Conway was to see two worlds collide, one built on distortion, the other on authenticity. For the progressive, immigrant-friendly, identity-proud audience watching, Crockett embodied their own struggles and aspirations. She wasn't speaking from some ivory tower. She was speaking from experience. Every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every Black American who had been dismissed or silenced, every working-class family who had been ignored, they could see themselves in her. She wasn't just a participant. She was their voice given form, their resilience on display. And so, when Conway smirked and delivered her latest distortion, it wasn't just Crockett sitting silently across from her. It was millions of Americans holding their breath, trusting that someone, finally, would not let arrogance have a last word. Crockett had been here before. She had stared down smugness, condescension, and power. She had endured worse and emerged stronger. That's why the audience leaned forward that night. That's why the nation tuned in with anticipation. Because this wasn't just a debate. It was a showdown between everything Conway represented and everything Crockett stood for. And when these two forces finally collided, the air in the room turned electric. The lights were hot, the cameras rolling, and the room seemed to shrink as Kellyanne and Conway leaned forward with the confidence of someone who believed she was in full command. Her voice carried that unmistakable tone, half lecture, half mockery, as she launched into a string of talking points polished by years of spin. Every phrase felt rehearsed, every gesture choreographed. She spoke as though the audience were school children, too naive to question her twisting of facts. "Let's be clear," she began, punctuating each word with a pointed finger. "The real problem here isn't leadership, it's laziness. People don't want to work hard anymore, and leaders like Representative Crockett would rather hand out excuses than demand accountability." The words dripped with condescension. She smiled smugly, waiting for the murmurs of approval that once greeted her in friendlier arenas. Instead, a quiet tension spread through the hall. The audience shifted in their seats, their discomfort visible. A few eyebrows raised. A handful of heads shook. They weren't buying it, not this time. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply listened, her calm presence amplifying the arrogance pouring from Conway's lips. The silence from Crockett wasn't weakness. It was suspense, and the audience could feel it. Every second she stayed quiet built anticipation, like the air before a storm. Conway, mistaking that composure for submission, pressed harder. Her words came faster, sharper, as if she sensed victory was near. She began stacking exaggerations on top of distortions, layering insult upon insult. "Look around," she said, gesturing broadly to the audience. "Do you want leaders who spend their careers defending criminals in courtrooms? Or leaders who actually fight for families who work hard? Because let's face it, some people in Washington care more about identity politics than they do about real Americans." The phrase "real Americans" landed with a thud. In the front row, a woman folded her arms tightly across her chest. Near the back, a young man shook his head in disbelief. The crowd wasn't energized. They were uneasy, as though they were watching someone cross an invisible line. Still, Conway didn't notice. She smirked, enjoying the sound of her own voice, mistaking the silence for agreement. "This country doesn't need slogans," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "It needs substance. And frankly, Representative Crockett has shown us she has neither." The arrogance hung in the air, heavy and sour. The tension had reached its breaking point. You could almost hear the audience holding their breath, waiting to see if Crockett would remain silent or rise. Conway leaned back in her chair. The grin of a victor spread across her face. What she didn't realize was that the silence hadn't weakened Crockett. It had strengthened her. The audience wasn't tuned to Conway anymore. They were watching Crockett, waiting, bracing for the response they knew was coming. But then, in just seconds, Crockett flipped the entire script. The smugness on Kellyanne Conway's face was still hanging in the air when Jasmine Crockett leaned ever so slightly toward the microphone. No teatrix. No raised voice. Just presence. Her timing was surgical, the kind of timing that comes not from practice, but from instinct. She let Conway's last barb linger for a heartbeat too long, forcing the audience to sit in the arrogance, to taste its bitterness. Then she struck. "Kellyanne," Crockett began, her tone level but edged with steel, "you keep talking about real Americans. Your gender when you demand equal pay and get laughed at. Identity isn't politics, it's people's lives. And if you don't understand that, then maybe you've been spinning stories so long you forgot what reality even looks like." The hall erupted again, this time with a mixture of laughter, applause, and cheers. Some audience members stood, clapping above their heads. The cameras captured faces lit up with admiration, mouths open in disbelief at the ferocity of Crockett's clarity. Conway's hands fidgeted now. She adjusted her microphone, cleared her throat, reached for her notes, searching desperately for a foothold. But the rhythm of the room was gone. It belonged to Crockett, and Crockett knew it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to force the room into silence again. "You've made a career out of twisting facts, Kellyanne, out of telling people that lies are just alternative truths. But tonight, there's no spin that can save you. Because the truth doesn't need a shout. It doesn't need a smirk. It just needs to be spoken plainly. And when it is..." She paused, letting the tension coil tight. The audience leaned forward, every ear straining. "It's unstoppable." The roar was deafening. Applause, whistles, laughter, even chants broke out. Conway's shoulders sank as if the sound itself were pressing her into her chair. She attempted a smile, but it flickered awkwardly. Her usual confidence dissolved into visible unease. She reached for a rebuttal, opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words wouldn't come. In those stretched-out seconds, time slowed. Cameras zoomed in on Conway's faltering expression, capturing the exact moment her armor cracked. Crockett sat steady, her eyes unwavering, her posture regal. It was cinematic, almost surreal. The villain undone not by volume or insult, but by clarity delivered with the sharpness of a scalpel. Conway fumbled her notes, flipping pages, mumbling under her breath as if a script might magically appear. But the damage was already done. The crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They were on their feet for Jasmine Crockett, clapping, cheering, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Crockett leaned back, composed, untouchable. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't in her posture. It was in the faces of the audience, in the thunder of their applause, in the way the nation would remember these few seconds forever. And just when Conway thought it couldn't get worse, the world outside that room erupted. The sound of applause inside the debate hall had barely faded when the outside world erupted. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop counterattack was everywhere. Phones glowed in the audience, recording, sharing, posting. Hashtags began trending before Conway even left the stage. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Truth in Seconds. Hashtag Alternative Facts No More. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Every feed became a river of Crockett's words, replayed in loop after loop. On TikTok, creators added dramatic background music to the clip, slowing down the moment Conway's smirk dissolved as Crockett's words cut through. Millions of views poured in. Memes exploded across Twitter. Split screens of Conway's fumbling expression beside Crockett's calm stare. Captions like "Spin Meet Spine" and "Reality Check" delivered. Late-night comedians wasted no time. One replayed the clip with exaggerated slow-motion sound effects, adding a referee's whistle over Conway's silence. Another joked, "Kellyanne Conway used to sell us alternative facts." Tonight, Jasmine Crockett gave her an alternative career suggestion: retire. The studio audience roared, just like the debate crowd had. But it wasn't just comedy, it was validation. Across social media, people poured out their admiration. Finally, someone said it like it is. This is what real leadership looks like. Crockett didn't just win a debate. She spoke for all of us who've had to sit quiet. While someone smirked in our faces, the comments multiplied, each one carrying the same pulse of relief, of vindication. Screenshots of tweets praising Crockett filled timelines. Influential voices weighed in, writers, activists, celebrities. A best-selling author tweeted, "That wasn't a clapback, it was a cultural reset." An immigrant rights group posted, "When Crockett spoke, our communities felt seen." A comedian wrote simply, "Mic dropped. History made." Meanwhile, Conway became the butt of the internet's favorite kind of joke: sharp, merciless, unforgettable. GIFs of her fumbling with her notes circulated with captions like, "Searching for a fact, any fact." Side-by-side memes compared her performance to a Wi-Fi signal cutting out. Even former colleagues quietly mocked her online, one writing, "We all knew the spin couldn't last forever." Cable news channels seized the story. The clip ran on a loop, dissected by panels, replayed with bold captions, "Crockett dismantles Conway." Anchors nodded gravely as they framed it as not just a debate moment, but a cultural one. Morning shows quoted the social media frenzy. Evening shows replayed the crowd's eruption. The cycle fed itself, each headline amplifying the impact. Other politicians noticed, too. Progressives rushed to praise Crockett, some admitting openly that they felt inspired. "That's how you do it," one congresswoman tweeted. "Direct, fearless, undeniable." Even moderates chimed in, remarking on Crockett's composure and clarity. For once, it seemed a moment of political theater cut across the noise and reminded people of what conviction looked like. Even critics, grudgingly, couldn't ignore it. Conservative commentators tried to spin the moment as rude or disrespectful, but their clips gained little traction compared to the tidal wave of celebration. The energy was too big, the audience too validated. People weren't just watching Crockett win an exchange. They were watching her articulate something they had carried in their hearts for years. Clips of the night dominated Twitter's trending list for days. TikTok edits paired Crockett's words with swelling orchestral music, some reaching millions of views. Young voters stitched the moment into their own videos, declaring, "This is why we show up." It became a rallying cry, a piece of political culture that transcended the event itself. And in living rooms across the country, Families rewatched the clip, nodding, laughing, clapping, even when no one else could hear. Parents showed it to their kids. College students played on laptops in dorm rooms. For many, it wasn't just entertainment. It was proof. Proof that arrogance could be challenged. Proof that truth, spoken with clarity, could still cut through. The ripple effects spread quickly. News outlets framed it as a defining moment in Crockett's rise. Pundits speculated about her political future, and grassroots groups seized it as a teaching tool. This is how you push back. This is how you hold power accountable. But beyond the memes and headlines, this moment carried something much deeper. In the days that followed, as the echoes of applause and the storm of social media settled into something steadier, the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's moment began to crystallize. It was never just about one debate or one takedown. It was about what her composure and clarity revealed, that in a world drowning in noise, authenticity still cuts through like lightning. Crockett didn't simply dismantle Kellyanne Conway's spin. She reframed the entire contest. What looked like a duel of words became a lesson about values. Conway leaned on arrogance, distortion, and the assumption that charm could overwrite truth. Crockett leaned on dignity, precision, and a voice grounded in lived experience. And America saw the contrast with startling clarity. For so long, manipulation has felt like the rule of politics. Spin doctors rise, truth feels negotiable, and ordinary people grow cynical. But Crockett's words reminded audiences that when truth is spoken plainly and fearlessly, it doesn't just survive, it thrives. It electrifies. It inspires. In that hall, and in millions of living rooms afterward, people saw proof that arrogance can crumble in seconds when faced with conviction. This was more than a personal victory. It was symbolic. Crockett embodied the modern America rising from the grassroots, one that values courage over deception, integrity over performance. She stood as a representative of communities who have been told for decades to sit quietly, to accept the distortions of those in power. Her voice carried theirs. Her victory was theirs. And the moral was unmistakable. You don't have to play dirty to win. You don't have to twist reality to make your case. In fact, the surest way to resonate in today's America is the opposite, to be unapologetically authentic, to be rooted in truth, to speak with the kind of calm strength that leaves arrogance exposed. Audiences left not only entertained, but affirmed. The moment sparked laughter, yes, but also pride, validation, and a quiet hope. People recognized that they were witnessing more than a viral clip. They were witnessing a cultural statement. The old era of manipulation is fading, and a new expectation of accountability is taking its place. That Crockett's performance reminded people of their own power. If one woman could stand against decades of spin and shatter it with composure, then perhaps ordinary people could do the same in their daily lives, calling out injustice, rejecting lies, holding firm in their truth. It was a call to courage, disguised as a debate exchange. That's why the moment lingered. It wasn't the cleverness of the line alone. It was the way it lifted the audience into a shared feeling of possibility, of belonging to something bigger than themselves. For one night, politics didn't feel like theater. It felt like a mirror, showing people who they could be at their best. Unshaken, authentic, true. And yet the biggest lesson of all is what? In seconds, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She ignited a movement. What happened on that stage wasn't a debate quip to be forgotten in tomorrow's headlines. It was a spark, proof that truth spoken with courage can shatter even the most polished arrogance. And that spark belongs to more than one person. It belongs to all of us. Because this fight isn't confined to podiums or televised forums. It's in our conversations at work, at school, at the dinner table. It's in the moments when someone tries to twist reality and we have the choice to stay silent or to speak. Crockett showed us that composure and clarity are more powerful than bluster. That dignity is not weakness, but strength. That when arrogance rises, it only takes one steady voice to bring it crashing down. And here's the truth. You're not just a spectator to this story. You're part of it. Every share, every comment, Every conversation that spreads moments like these adds to the momentum. It tells the world that people are hungry for authenticity, that we won't be distracted by spin, that courage is contagious. So if you felt that spark tonight, don't let fade. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of the movement that says enough is enough. Because Crockett's victory isn't just hers, it's ours. And every time we carry that lesson forward, we prove that arrogance will always meet its match. Because when arrogance meets courage, courage wins.